Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Michael Brady. Welcome to Climate Change, Science, and Solutions. Most descriptions of climate change science and its potential solutions are heavy on facts, and I'll get to some of those facts. But I wanted to start with a story. Now, that kid there in those great striped pants is me sometime in the early to mid 1970s. And as you can see, I started out with just a bit of attitude. And just to the right of those pants is a picture of Portage Glacier in Alaska, taken around the same time. Now, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I was in the military, and I was stationed about an hour north of that glacier. You can see a picture of me right there with lots of hair that I no longer have. And I think that picture was taken right after I got out of the military. Now, while in Alaska, I canoed up close to the face of that glacier. Though you shouldn't never get too close, it can be kind of dangerous. I still have that canoe. That's the picture of it right there. And I can tell you that glacier seemed unbelievably big from the seat of a canoe. Far too huge to melt if I had ever thought that was possible then. When I was there, that section that you're looking at near the river was around the size of the Webster campus, but taller, much taller. And today, thanks to the wonder of Reddit, you can see a contemporary picture of that exact spot where I canoed. And you should also see that that glacier has now completely receded from the shore of the river in my lifetime. Now, it's very weird. It is hard to express the mixture of loss, sadness, and really anger this brings me. I can barely think about that loss of the glacier without crying or wanting to scream. And really, I don't cry easily. So we need to learn the science of climate change. But more importantly, we need to think very hard about the possible solutions. Because we need to keep the speed of this change in mind. It really wasn't that long ago that I was wearing those striped pants. Years ago, when I first started teaching this class, I spent a lot of time trying to convince, about a quarter of the students that the science of climate change was correct, that climate change even existed. Happily, things have moved on from that. Today, even the biggest drivers of climate change and climate change denial, like Exxon or BP, no longer try to pretend it's not real. In fact, they are fighting tooth and nail to protect the business of fossil fuel extraction and use. But they no longer deny that climate change itself is real. We'll come back to them. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, usually shortened to IPCC, that's what I'll call it from now on, has been studying this science and releasing reports for about 30 years now. The most recent report is a massive undertaking. It really is a wonder of governmental and scientific cooperation. The most often quoted sections are here, and I'll take you through them bit by bit. But first, let me encourage you to go check it out yourself. The Summary for Policymakers report from the IPCC is very easy to follow. It is what I largely use here for the graphs. But even the longer report is mostly readable for a non-scientist like me. And the headline that best summarizes the mixture of optimism and warning from this most recent 2021 IPCC report is right here. You can read that for yourself. And as this paired image shows, the hope of stopping all climate change that early adopters like me used to hope for is really just gone. That's no longer a thing. We already have significant warming right now, today. And it turns out that around the same time I was canoeing up to that glacier, there was a large rise in temperature, especially near the poles. And even the most optimistic research or modeling does not think we're ever going back to those days. But there is still time to limit the more serious outcomes. So in my view, the most important piece of science and modeling from this report is right here. It compares 5 different shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs. If you want to go dig into the document, you'll find that these SSPs are shorthand for the collective decisions we make as a species. It may seem a bit difficult to talk about ourselves as a species and not as individuals or citizens or whatever. But that is the level of discourse they use, and I really do think it's the level of discourse that is needed to understand this problem. We've gone beyond easy solutions and now must ask things like, how seriously do us inhabitants of this planet take this issue? How seriously do governments take this issue? How seriously do businesses and consumers take this issue? And most importantly, and this is the most important thing, what types of large-scale policies can we and will we institute? This helpful graph from Our World in Data, a great site, you should go check it out, explains what these different SSPs, shared socioeconomic policies, mean. At the top, we can see that if we fall off from our current policies and do little or nothing, as many prominent politicians right now today in the world say we should do, we are looking at an almost unimaginable scale of change in your lifetime. Some guesses suggest things like no more living in the hotter areas of the world, pretty much anywhere around the equator. No more living in deserts. Massive rise in sea level as the glaciers melt, and many, many other disturbing effects. So hopefully you can see we don't want that. In the middle of the graph, you should see that if we stay with our current policies and actually reach the present targets that have been set at Paris and other places that are coming right now, which, by the way, is not happening, we're not meeting those, we are looking at a temperature rise somewhere in the 2.7 to 3.1 degrees Celsius range. Now, even this will bring changes that are very hard to predict. Today, where we're somewhere around 1 degree of warming Celsius, we're already seeing worse heat waves, worse rain, worse hurricanes, climate refugees, suffering, and some very unpredictable outcomes. It is likely that this would get much worse if we stay on our current course. So, at the very bottom of the graph, you can see their predictions for the best possible outcomes at this point. And that is still going to be about 1 degree warmer than we are right now. But note that in our current world political structure, this level of change and this level of adaptation to this problem is very unlikely and can only happen if we radically shift policies. But I have to say that this should be our goal in any sensible, serious view of the climate science. Another important innovation in climate science over the last 10 years or so has been the detailed tracking of emissions by country, region, business, and even individual use. And long story short, the problem has grown so large and so global that small-scale individual actions will probably not have much of an effect. Now, some selfish or overly individualistic people hear the words I just said and think, okay, that means they could do nothing. There's no chance they can help, so they might as well just, live life while they can live life. But this selfish individualistic reasoning has a fatal flaw. We all, including those people, live in a deeply interconnected world. There's no way to avoid that fact. And besides, they're simply wrong on the possible effects that individuals could have. As someone who's been following this issue since the early 1990s, I can tell you that many individuals have already had a big effect. An author named Bill McKibben wrote a book called The End of Nature that me and thousands of others read in the early 1990s, and it completely altered my worldview. This class is a direct result of that change in worldview. And effects just like these have been growing at a geometric rate in recent years, as many individuals wake up to the dangers we're facing. So, with that in mind, let me summarize the main sources of emission, as in some ways it's quite easy to explain. Nearly all of the causes come down to burning some ancient stuff. It can be ancient fossils in the form of coal, oil, fossil gas, sometimes called natural gas. But if you dig it up, pump it up, or cut it down and burn it, it's contributing to climate change. Whether you burn it to make electricity or to heat your house in the winter, it's an emission leading to climate change. And this burning comes in a million other ways. It can be obvious, like driving a car that uses gasoline, or it can be less obvious, like a new building made with concrete. It can also even be more indirect, like the specific use that agricultural land is set up for. Now, we all need to eat to live, but how much fossil fuel infrastructure and space is needed to build that calorie you're going to eat contributes to this overall picture in a big way. So, in short, it takes way more carbon to create a calorie of beef than a calorie from a lentil, obviously. Now, all of these things are important. We need food, heat, houses, stuff like that. But some of these are actually hard to change, while others are what I'm going to say fake hard to change. Some of these changes require a completely new development in technology, and they're very hard to do and to change today. Others only need us to do the things we already know how to do today. And the only reason we're not doing it is because it's in someone's economic interest to block it. For example, there is currently no good way to replace concrete with a less costly alternative. They are working on it, but right now we're stuck with the 6% of climate cost worldwide that comes from concrete. On the other side of this, my father, when I was growing up, owned a heating and cooling company. And I can tell you that a completely understood and easily accomplished series of insulation techniques that have been tested thousands of times could lower our heating and cooling costs by at least 25%. Now, this would lead to a massive reduction in climate costs, as heating and cooling are about 20 to 25% of all climate costs. But all the resistance to this idea about insulation and conservation comes from just the lack of will. The interests of fossil fuel electricity generators, home builders, and landlords have been given preference over the needs of climate change and saving the earth. Nothing really is needed for this to happen except changing who gets to decide the building codes for new buildings. I bring up this simple change because when we look at these frankly depressing and overwhelmingly complex charts and graphs, it's hard to handle the scope of this problem. I'm with you. It is hard. But there are dozens of binaries like this. Some things actually are hard to change, or they'll require a new technology that does not fully exist yet, like large-scale affordable battery storage for wind and solar. But just on the other side of that, other things like battery storage for homes and smaller buildings already exist today. All we really need is the political will to retrofit old homes and build this into new homes. There's not really a new cost here, as we are already paying for it and will pay for it in climate costs and energy loss that will eventually bury us, literally bury us, if we do not change our ways. The unfortunate truth of all this is that companies and their political friends have been behind much of the resistance to climate change. Now, I know, for some of you, this might sound like an opinion, but the internal documents themselves from Exxon, Shell, BP, and other companies show beyond a doubt that these companies knew, somewhere in the 1980s, exactly what was going to happen. Their own scientists predicted it. And worse than that, they then went on to create a giant misinformation structure to attack anyone reporting on this new science or advocating for climate change. Some point of evidence here is that the state of New York is actually suing Exxon right now in court over that exact thing. So I'd like to go a little further and humanize the scale of the climate crisis we're facing. When these things are unimaginably large, it's too easy to forget that specific individuals at specific companies are making decisions every day that will affect the future of the entire planet. Now, the recent history of corporations is a history of consolidation. Big companies buy smaller companies, consolidate, and then do it again. This means that fewer and fewer companies have bigger sections of the world economy under their control. When it comes to climate, somewhere around 70% of all global emissions come from only 100 companies. And each of these companies has a single CEO, a single person. All of this is easily accessible public knowledge. Academic groups and journalists have made detailed lists of these 100 people and the companies they lead. And in some ways, this is a good thing. It makes it very easy to find and focus on these companies and individuals that we need to pressure to change the current policies. Remember that we are currently weighing the needs of the entire species against the needs of 100 companies and 100 CEOs. Now, of course, in our current political world, it's not that simple. I get that. But it could be that simple if we would just wake up to the real scale of this issue. Now, I am what's called a pragmatist in the philosophy world. And a pragmatist holds ideals without holding them too tightly. For example, democracy should both drive and guide our actions, is one of my ideals. We should be trying to make our government more democratic, but our businesses, culture, and home lives should also become more democratic. For pragmatists, ideals themselves are open to change. If times change, our ideals should change as well. The ideal of democracy today does not mean the same thing as it did in the 1950s, much less in the 1780s. If you have not enlarged your circle to include more people and more diversity in your ideal of democracy as times change, then you're simply living in a past world that does not exist anymore. And it was a world that was much more unjust and often more hateful than today's world. So, in our everyday lives, our circles are often small and hard-shelled. Some family, friends, work colleagues, maybe a few others. And when something new, unfamiliar, uncertain, or especially scary comes along, most people want to shrink or harden their circle even more. But I want to argue that this tendency to shrink and harden our circle is the most dangerous thing we can do right now. It's much, much more dangerous than the actual emissions driving climate change. We can prevent much damage if we will just enlarge our circle to handle this crisis. Unfortunately, the tendency to close off our circles is very strong right now. Richer countries are blaming poorer countries are blaming richer countries, rich countries are blaming other rich countries, businesses are desperately trying to protect their economic interests, kids are blaming adults for the mess they have left behind, and most people are just going around in a haze of denial and apathy. Worse yet, many of these complaints are, in fact, just true and justified. But as the data we looked at earlier shows, this fragmented approach will never work. This problem is just too big. It will literally sink us all. We need a new ideal, a new circle that includes our entire planet. Now, I'm well aware this sounds impossible. I know it is very unlikely, and I know it is too early for us to hear, but it's still exactly what I need. We need a bigger circle. Now, the second part of the pragmatic argument I'm giving you here is that your actions matter because they signal your true beliefs. Pluralism is the general rule for pragmatism. There are nearly infinite ways to be and to be accepted. This is equally true for actions. Some can lead a movement, some can write a book, some might cast a vote, some can send in a couple of dollars, and some can even teach. But when it comes to actions, you must do your part, big or small. It's a big and very pluralistic circle, but it is a circle and we're all in there together. So, if someone tells me that they think climate change is a serious problem, maybe the most serious problem, which of course it is, I just wait to see what they actually do with their life. If they go about their degree, their life, their job, and most especially their public actions like voting, as if climate change does not really matter, what are we to think about the real importance they attach to climate change? The last time I checked, nothing is still nothing. Now, this pragmatic tool should be used very carefully, as judgment should always come after evidence and should always be as charitable as possible. But keep in mind how useful this pragmatic tool is, especially for public figures. If your president, prime minister, religious leader, or corporate leader says they think climate change is serious, and then they do little or nothing, you should call BS. You should steal and repurpose James Baldwin's wonderful line and say, or scream it if necessary, "I can't believe what you say because I see what you do." Now, the scale of the climate change problem will require large compromises. In our current political world, there is a tendency for purity tests among partisans, and many a sharply worded, "You're with us or against us." One characteristic of a pragmatist is that they would rather win than remain pure. And in this case, winning means maintaining a livable environment on this earth. Nearly everything else needs to come second to this idea. Now, this does not mean that everything can or should be part of a compromise. And this does not mean that we toss our other ideals, like democracy, aside. But for our climate circle to enlarge, we'll have to cooperate with people that we might not otherwise want to work with. This is a serious problem, and we should take it seriously. Anyone that wants to save our environment is on side. So one of the main lessons from the IPCC report is that a certain amount of climate change is now unavoidable, and the clock is ticking. The longer we wait to take real action, the more radical those later actions will have to be to deal with the problem. If we can get our global act together in the next 10 to 20 years, our daily lives will largely be the same as they are today, with some notable exceptions like small island nations and coastal areas. But here's the key. The longer we wait for someone else to magically solve this problem, the fewer and more radical our choices will become, and the less likely they will actually work. For example, there's been a huge investment in the growth of green energy recently. But the sad truth is that the green tech is simply not ready to produce the amount of power needed in the world. And this is especially true in large countries like China and India, where they're trying, and many times succeeding, in bringing their populace out of poverty. As big as the investment in green energy has been, it needs to be much bigger. The tech needs to be so inexpensive that it can compete with coal, the current choice of most of these large economies. Now, much of this comes down to the scalability and large-scale power storage for green energy. Because no country really wants to use coal, they use coal because it's their only practical choice in a messy and unfair economic system. So one of the better arguments I've seen is that we need an interim power source from nuclear power until green power is ready to dominate the large-scale sector. Now, I immediately hear a response from many people. But let me just say that it is simply a myth that nuclear power is dangerous. Now, don't take my word. Go research it yourself if you need to. But it's a fact that far more people have died and will die from fossil fuel use than ever died from nuclear power. And it's really not even close. Thousands and thousands of people die every year from fossil fuels, and hardly anyone has died, depending on how you count, from nuclear power. And this is a good example of old ideals not changing with the times and the risks. Now, if you're an old school environmentalist like I grew up around, what I just said would sound literally like treason. For my whole life, the majority of environmentalists argued, and really quite successfully, against the wide-scale use of nuclear power. Now, during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, there was some argument to be made here, maybe. But it's no longer the same world that we lived in then. There are newer styles of reactors, and some of the most promising technologies out there are in nuclear power. And whether you know it or not, many states and many countries have quietly relied on nuclear power for a generation now, for 30, 40 years. If you live in Missouri or Illinois, like most of us do, it has been one of the largest sources of power for the last 30 years. And this is just the type of compromise we likely need to make. It's not a perfect compromise, it's not a perfect solution, but it's one we need right now, today, to stop using coal and natural gas. And at least until the green power industry gets up a bit to be stronger and more technologically mature. Now, everything I've said up to this point has been leading up to the real solutions we'll need. Our approach to the world and green energy are vital steps toward a sustainable future, but they will never reach the scale we need on their own. We certainly need to match our beliefs about climate to our everyday actions, and we need massive government-level investment in both interim energy and green energy. But the scale of this problem requires an economic and political pressure campaign, the likes of which the world has never seen. Make no mistake, the 100 most polluting companies and their CEOs know exactly what they're doing. They have known it for about 40 years. The documents are traced back to the 1980s. Just ignore their words and their slick advertising campaigns that you see everywhere, and look at their corporate actions. It's perfectly clear that their goal is to get every drop of oil and flake of coal out of the ground and burn it for profit. And likewise, the world politicians are well aware of the actions of these companies. In fact, they're usually supporting their behavior in every way they can. In places like the USA, many of these companies are still massively subsidized by taxpayers today to burn fossil fuels. And very few countries do any better than the US. Even slightly better performing places like Germany are unaccountably today closing their nuclear power plants and switching to fossil fuels like coal and imported fossil fuels like natural gas. These political actions from the US and Germany are exactly the opposite of what is needed. And they really just get away with it because we let them. The good news is the solution is clear, pretty easy to understand, even if it's probably difficult to accomplish. These companies and their individual CEOs need to be targeted in every way possible. There should never be a moment of economic peace for these 100 climate culprits. As some smaller but high polluting companies like clothing companies have learned, people will vote with their paychecks. Nearly every clothing company must today at least pretend to sustainability, and some of them are actually changing their business model and being rewarded for it. This green buying has spread to lots of places. Plant-based milks are now 35% of the milk market. Plant-based meats are around 18% and growing quickly. And even cars, one of the last holdouts to change, are now about 5% electric and hybrid and also growing quite quickly. Every dollar you spend in a greener way will pressure these CEOs. In fact, it might be the only thing they'll understand. But we also need to go after these companies in the all too cozy reception they get from our governments. It cannot be acceptable for taxpayers to secretly pay these companies to burn fossil fuels. And the true cost of what they have done to the world, while lying about it, must be paid by them. Politicians of every stripe should be rewarded for pro-climate votes and severely punished in the ballot box when they side with those who are selling your future for short-term profit. Like you, I have many other political interests and goals, but the truth is that none of them will matter much in the world if it's destroyed for profit. Many of the issues we are facing today, like creeping authoritarianism, racism, and inequality, will be much, much worse if our climate collapses. So until we can slow climate change, all votes will be climate votes. Every dollar spent will have some climate effect. And even our daily interactions and choices will matter. I wish I had something easier to tell you, but I don't. Climate change will require us to change if we want the world to become better.